When the angel met the women at the empty tomb on Easter morning, he instructed them to take a message to the disciples. The angel said, "Go quickly and tell them, Jesus has risen from the dead and is going ahead of you to Galilee. There you will see him." In other words, Jesus was gone. He wasn't there. He was alive and he was loose and in the world. And furthermore, if the disciples wanted to see him, they needed to go home. I've often wondered if that last part didn't catch the disciples a little bit off guard. Surely the risen Christ had more important places to be than in Galilee. I mean, Galilee was basically a collection of small fishing villages. That's what it was, with names like Nazareth, Capernaum, Cana. No one important lived in any of those towns. In fact, when the disciple Nathanael first heard that Jesus was from there, he said, "Can anything good come out of Nazareth?" That was the general consensus about Galilee as a whole. I don't know if you've ever seen one of those lists that sometimes comes out. I've seen them on Facebook before. It'll say the 10 worst cities in which to live. 10 worst cities in Iowa. You know, if there had been a list like that for the Holy Lands, probably most of the towns on that list would have been in Galilee. In many people's eyes, Galilee was a disgrace. But on that Easter morning, the angel was telling the disciples that if they wanted to experience the power of the risen Christ, they had to leave the holy city of Jerusalem, which is where the temple was. It's where all the action was, really. And they needed to go back to where it all started. Galilee was their home. It's where Jesus began his ministry. It's where they all grew up. And now, according to the gospel, it was the place where the disciples would experience the power of the risen Christ as well. In Luke's gospel, we find the story of Jesus' resurrection right at the beginning of chapter 24. It's 12 verses long. That's all. 12 verses for the whole, pretty much, Easter story. But then Luke does something that's, I think, kind of neat. It's almost like a movie where the camera shifts from the empty tomb and from the cemetery early that morning, and suddenly we're on the outskirts of Jerusalem, and we're watching as two disciples, formerly unnamed disciples, make their way home from Jerusalem. Only these two guys weren't from Galilee. They were from Emmaus, which is only about 7 miles or so from Jerusalem. Apparently, after the trauma of everything that had happened in the last couple of days with Jesus' arrest and his trial and his crucifixion, they just wanted to get out of Dodge. Luke tells us that they were, getting away from Jerusalem on their way home when they were suddenly joined by a stranger who engages them in conversation. So I'm going to let Luke tell the story. And this is right where we pick up after the Easter story in verse 13, but it's a lot longer. All right. Now, on that same day, Easter Sunday, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. While they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them. But their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad. Then one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet, mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel." Yes, and besides all this, it is now the third day since these things took place. Moreover, some women from our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him. Then Jesus said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory? Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him strongly, saying, 'Stay with us, because it is almost evening and the day is now nearly over.' So he went in to stay with them. When he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed and broke it, and gave it to them. Then their eyes were opened, and they recognized him, and he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, 'Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking to us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?' That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, 'The Lord has risen indeed, and he has appeared to Simon.' Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread." Now that's a long story. It's nearly twice as long as the story of Jesus' resurrection, which is right before it. But I think one of the reasons this story is so important is that it shows us that Jesus' post-resurrection appearances to his disciples, to his followers, weren't isolated events. They were happening to others too, all over the place. Not only did Jesus appear to Mary Magdalene and Simon Peter and John, but also to some guy named Cleopas, right? And some other guy from Emmaus, whose name we don't even know. He came alongside them, and he joined them in their journey. This week, we're beginning a new sermon series called Bloom Where You're Planted. When I read this particular story for today from Luke, I realized it was the perfect scripture to kick off our new series. The two disciples who were traveling from Jerusalem to Emmaus were so caught up in their own little world and everything that had happened that they were completely oblivious to the presence of the risen Christ right there with them. Even when the stranger began to connect the dots for them, helping them to understand how everything in Israel's history had pointed to the fact that Jesus was the Messiah, and they were caught up in this story, they were still blind to his presence. Even when their hearts burned within them, they still didn't see. What that tells me is that one of the biggest barriers to living in the power of the resurrection, and therefore blooming where we're planted, is blind eyes and closed minds. We either assume that the real action must be someplace else, right? Someplace more interesting than here, someplace far more interesting than where I live and what I'm doing, or else we get so caught up in our own stuff, our own drama, our own struggles, our own anxieties or depression or whatever it is that we get tunnel vision. Either way, whether we assume it's someplace else or we're so caught up in where we're at, we become blind to God's activity, even when it's right under our noses, even when it's right there. I remember something that happened to me years ago now that helped me understand this about myself a little bit better. And strangely enough, this particular revelation happened to me while I was mowing my yard. And I didn't have a very big yard then, but I mowed it like I do a lot of things, kind of single-mindedly. right? If I'm mowing, I'm mowing. If I'm doing something else, I'm doing that. It's all I'm thinking about. And I had this kind of optimal pattern that I followed whenever I mowed my yard, which I'd figured out over years of mowing, right? So I always mowed it exactly the same way because I knew that was the best way to do it. I'm sure some of you know exactly what I'm talking about. And then one day, I was dutifully mowing my grass, following my optimal pattern, when I noticed these beautiful flowers. They were growing right under a garage window in the back of my house. And I realized I didn't think I'd ever seen them before. So I kind of stopped and I looked at them, and they were perfect and they were beautiful. And my first thought was how many times have I been past these flowers, even today, and didn't even see them? And then my next thought was, what else am I missing? Nowadays, when I'm working in the yard and I get a little tired, I just lay down on the ground and look up in the sky. It's one of my favorite things to do. And I realize it might be a little alarming for my neighbors when they see me there. So if somebody's driving by, I will always kind of sit up and, wave. But in fact, a couple of weeks ago, I was out doing something in the yard, got tired, and I laid down just a little bit too fast. And I'm still not sure if it was my smartwatch or my phone, thought I'd fallen, and it sent Tammy an emergency text message. And I'm pretty sure it was about ready to call 911 before I finally got it shut off. But the other thing, too, is if I lay there long enough, sometimes the vultures will begin to swirl above me. But anyway, what it's helped me to do is just slow down a little bit, which I need at times, and just see the beauty in the world. And a couple of years ago, I was doing that. I was out there working, laid down in the grass, and a baby deer spotted me and got curious and came over, and I bet got within 20 or 30 feet of me, and we had this little conversation. I talked to this baby deer for probably 10 minutes before she just wandered off. I do that. Tammy knows. I talk to animals all the time, especially deer. But something I've learned about myself is that I can get so busy and so hyper-focused on whatever it is that I'm doing that I miss out on a lot. And I'm pretty sure I'm not the only one. Those two disciples, on their way home from Emmaus, they were so focused on everything that had happened in that past week, on the trauma that they had experienced, at their grief in losing Jesus, that they were literally blind to His presence right there with them. They were so intent on escaping everything that they had just experienced that they couldn't see anything else. One of the things I've noticed over the years in working with people in recovery is that oftentimes people who are struggling with addiction will come to the conclusion that the only way that they can get better is if they pick up and move. Just get away from everything. Kind of like those disciples running away from Jerusalem. They think a change in location is the only thing that's going to help them. And I get that. In AA, sometimes that's called the geographical cure. And while it might sometimes help, it certainly can't be the only thing. Because here's the problem with the geographical cure. What people discover oftentimes is that addiction and self-deception and sin, they don't really care where you go. They will follow you, right? As someone once said, everywhere I go, there I am, and I make a mess of things, right? And that's true. It's true. Everywhere you go, there you are. But there's something equally and joyfully true, and that's the fact that everywhere you go, God is already there. One of the recurring scriptures in the Chosen series that we've been watching on Wednesday nights is Psalm 139. When the disciples are scared or if they're in danger, they often repeat the words, "Where can I go from your Spirit? Where can I flee from your presence? If I go up to the heavens, you are there. If I make my bed in the depths, you are there." The message of the Bible is clear. God is with us always, even in the most familiar places, even when we don't recognize it. We don't have to pick up and move and go someplace else to experience the power of the risen Christ. We just have to open our eyes and discover that He's been with us the entire time. We can bloom right where we are. We can enter into the power of the risen Christ in our own Galilee or Emmaus or Keokuk or fill in the blank. And this isn't some kind of theory, and it's not wishful thinking. It's something I see happening all the time. People coming to life. I see it. They're blooming right where they're planted. And not only do I see it, but other people see it too. It's why the church grew so quickly in the beginning. It's why the church grows now. It's the primary reason, because people see something happening and they want to be a part of it as well. The risen Christ first appeared to Mary, and then to the disciples, and then to those two on the road to Emmaus, and then to many, many more. The Gospels tell us that. They all then became witnesses to the fact that Jesus was loose in the world. He wasn't stuck in a grave. He was out there in the world. He was meeting people where they were and changing their lives, and when people saw that, they wanted to be a part of it too. In my sermon preparation for this week, I came across a reference to a painting I'd never heard of by a Spanish artist from the 17th century called The Kitchen Maid. And I just absolutely love it. Here's a picture of it, of the painting. And as you can see, in the foreground of the painting is the kitchen maid, right? Doing something there in the kitchen. And then if you can see off to her, I guess my left, her right, there are a couple of people sitting at a table in the distance. Okay? And since we just read the story about the disciples on the road to Emmaus, you could probably guess who those travelers are that are sitting there in the inn where she's working. And if you look at her, you can see that the focus of her attention isn't so much on her tasks. Her attention seems to be rather on the conversation that's going on in the other room. What she is overhearing is the end of the story that we just read. When Jesus was revealed to those disciples on the road to Emmaus, or rather in the breaking of bread. She was a witness, right? The news was already beginning to spread. People were seeing it. In Luke's story, the disciples' eyes were opened in the breaking of bread when Jesus took bread and blessed it and broke it, just like He did with the 12 on the night of His arrest. And when the eyes of the travelers were finally opened, I love what happens. Jesus, first He disappears from their sight, but then they begin to think about the day. And they begin to think about the conversation they had with Him, and they realized that there was a part of them that knew it was Him, even before He was fully revealed. They said, "Were not our hearts burning within us while He was talking to us on the road, when He was opening the Scriptures to us?" I love that because I've had that experience too. Especially when I'm listening to somebody preach or teach who really seems to get it. Even before I may fully understand rationally, intellectually what they're saying, it's almost as if my heart is already there. It burns with understanding even before my brain has a chance to catch up. When Jesus joined the travelers and began to teach them, beginning with Moses and with the prophets, He was trying to help them understand that they were a part of something ancient. A story that began long, long before them. Here they are, still hyper-focused on the trauma of the past week, on what was happening right then. And the risen Christ wants them to see they are a part of a bigger picture. He wants them to understand that they are a part of a story that's thousands of years old, and that they get to be a part of it now. That they are a part of it now. And that same story continues with us. Like the first disciples, we are now called to be on the front lines, just like they were. And we do that simply by waking up to the fact that there is no place we can go to get away from the love of God. If we ascend to the heavens, He is there. If we descend to the depths, He is there. And when we go about our lives hyper-focused on our work or our worries or whatever else, He's there too. So why not come alive right now? Why not share that love and that life with others? Why not bloom where you're planted?